Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to be doing something completely different than what I normally do. Instead of narrating other people's stories, I'm going to let someone tell their story in their own words. This person is my cousin who recently told me about activity that has been happening around his home for the last 35 years that, while taken as isolated incidents, don't seem like much, but when you put it all together, it certainly seems like he has Sasquatch activity, not only just around his home, but in the area of Virginia where he lives. I was going to listen to his story and narrate it in my own words like I usually do, but I knew I just couldn't do it justice. So we recorded his story podcast style where we discuss cryptids, Sasquatch, and what is going on in Southeast Virginia, not just to him, but his neighbors and others who live close by. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's story.
This isn't really like a joke or a hobby. It's something that you just become aware of over time, that it's happening and that it's happening a lot. Take for example, what I'm going to read out tonight and list out some of the things that have gone on around here. We don't live way out in the boonies. I mean, you could probably say, yes, I do live in the country, but it's only a couple miles to a shopping center for us. We are not a remote location. They are not, as we once thought, only in remote areas. We used to think back in the 80s and 90s when we relied upon documentaries on cable that you had to go out into the Everglades or Mount Everest or the Pacific Northwest to have interactions with these beings, creatures. And that's just not the case. In the early 2000s, we began to realize that they were in pretty much all the states. And except for Hawaii, I think Hawaii is the only one for some reason that we don't seem to have reports on. And then we began to realize that not only are they in every state, but they're in nearly every county of every state. And I studied the subject for a long time before I began to put two and two together about some of the things that had occurred around our place. I live in Virginia, and Virginia has a ton of sightings, but it's not considered one of the top states by any means. I mean, the top states you hear the most for this kind of stuff are West Virginia, Kentucky, Washington State, Oregon, and Michigan, Wisconsin. And it's hard to pick because Texas and Tennessee have a ton. New York has a whole bunch. So there's a lot of states that are known as hotbeds for sightings and interactions. And I had never really considered Virginia to be one of those at all, certainly not the area that I live in. Now, I'll send over, if you can put up on the screen so people can see an aerial shot from Google Earth of the area I live in. And we do have a lot of lakes, and we have a lot of woods, and we have a lot of fields. And I would say we're pretty much on the edge of, what do you want to call it? Not society. I mean, that sounds kind of funny, but development, the developed town. And there is a lot of people who live in environments like this that are having encounters. A high school friend of mine who lives in Spotsylvania County, which is central Virginia and is very populated. It has a heavy population now. It hasn't always, but it does now. And 2 years ago, she and her daughters and her husband were out doing the backyard camping thing. And in the middle of the night, they began to have interaction. They began to hear things and feel things stomping on the ground and whatnot that was not normal. And they heard one of these things walking away down to the river. The Rappahannock River is really close to where they live. And this happened a couple times, a couple of different nights. Now, needless to say, they ran back inside their house after the first night, but it happened several times after that. And then about 2 weeks later, a young teenager who was down along the river fishing disappeared, and they never did find the guy. And so the reason I bring this up is this type of stuff is happening in suburban areas. It really is. As long as you have some woods, then you're set to go. You're going to have, and most people who are listening to this, I would say, unless you live in an urban area, you are going to have some activity around your home. And some of the cryptids, even in urban areas. That's not really what I want to get into tonight, but it's not to say that if you live in an urban area that you're protected from these things, because there are sightings in cities that you would never even think of that occur. The very first, and what I want to do, what's so interesting about this is I'm not coming on here tonight saying that I'm going to offer proof that I have forest giants living around our property, because we've discussed it here, the family and I have discussed it, and I feel like it's probably a 50-50 chance. Every single thing I'm going to read off on here can be chalked up to, well, it could have been that, or it could have been this. The problem is, and I think people will probably see this, as I'm listing them off and reading about them, after a while you begin to say, okay, how many times do you say, okay, this could have been this or that? And then some of the things that occur begin to start matching up with things that Scott Carpenter talks about. He is pretty much the authority on these beings. And like we've talked about before, he's the guy who got into researching them and then realized he didn't want to when they followed him home. And he revolutionized studying these creatures by putting his camera on his shoulder facing backwards. And as recently as last week, he caught them staring at him, and you can see the eyes and whatnot staring at him as he walks down the trail. But the first thing on my list, and bear in mind that this list, I kind of made it fairly recently, because up until, I want to say 2020 that the light bulb went off, and I thought to myself, oh my gosh, this stuff that's been happening. I don't know if you're in denial or if you're thinking that it has to be Mount Rainier in Washington State is where these things live. You always tend to think it can't be near my home.
Right. Before you get started, though,
yeah,
I just wanted to point out that you say one thing happens another, and it just continues to mount up, and the different things that happen continue to add up, and there's more and more and more. And one or two, like you said, one or two, like back in the 90s, story or two comes out of the Pacific Northwest about a Sasquatch. That's nothing. That's nothing.
Right.
But when these stories start coming in, thousands and thousands, year after year after year, all over the world, and I know that's more of some of the other cryptids, it's all over the world, but some Sasquatch all over the world, it just continues to be more than a coincidence. So the fact that all of this stuff, like you said, it's 50-50, it could go either way. It just, as it continues to mount and the evidence continues to stack up, it's kind of hard to ignore and dismiss it as just coincidence or as just, certain things. And that's the only point I wanted to make. So I'll let you get started.
No, it's true. It's a good point. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting, and this is the reason why I thought this would make a good show. Not because I'm going to come in here and try to convince everybody, because I'm really not. The fact of the matter is, I've spent in my teenage years a lot of time back in those woods. I look because I'm looking out the window, I can see them. A lot of time. I camped back there. I used to ride my four-wheeler back there in the middle of the night, way back in there. I used to fish back there so much that I knew every tree and every log and what types of fish were around them. And I can say that in all that time, I never once had one thing happen that I can point to that was odd. It was 100% normal. There was one or two times riding my four-wheeler that the thought entered my mind, if there was anything nefarious back here, I'm out here in the middle of nowhere. And there was a couple times when some thought, but that's all they were. And I kept right on riding. It was nothing else. So it has to be remembered that these beings, they are expert at concealing themselves, and they do conceal themselves masterfully until they don't. Why they do and why they don't, we do not know. Why do they allow themselves to be seen crossing a road when we know full well that it's easy to not be seen crossing a road? If you don't want to be seen, it's easy to avoid. When I was a kid, we used to play out when I lived in Maryland, out in the woods and whatnot. And if the cars that went by never knew we were there. I mean, it's so easy at nighttime to conceal yourself, and the drivers have no idea that there was half a dozen kids in the woods watching them drive past. And we did this every night. So if they're seen crossing the road, it's because they want to be seen. So why sometimes are they willing to reveal themselves and other times not? But the very first thing I wanted to mention, and this was actually before our house was even built on this property, but our neighbor's house had been built. He built his and moved in like, I don't know, 2 or 3 years before we did. And he had this large lab, a big husky chocolate lab that we all loved. And this lab at one point, our neighbor on the other side, and when I say neighbor, our neighbors are probably 200 yards from us on either side. And there's woods separating my one neighbor, so we can't see them. And there's a field separating the other. But he went out. This lab had one time had taken on a whole pack of hunting dogs, and apparently he came out on top. So he was a big, husky, aggressive dog. We loved this dog. He was great. And one night, just a random night, my neighbor went to let him out to go in the backyard. My neighbor's house sits maybe 25 yards from the edge of the tree line. And then there's woods. The lake is in the woods, and there's more woods. And it's pretty remote. Not remote, but it's very wooded, natural area. And when he opened the door and the dog began to go out, something roared from the tree line so loud that the lab ran back inside, got under the kitchen table, and refused to come out. And he told us this story. It's funny, my dad forgot about the story, but I never forgot it. And we immediately, when we heard the story, went to what must be like a cougar or something, because even though the state refuses to admit that we have them, there's plenty of evidence that there are cougars. But the man didn't seem to really think that it was a cougar. The way he described it wasn't really cat-like. He described it as a roar, and very loud. He had no idea. So a couple years later, my friends and I used to go back in the woods, and again, I'm like 16 at this time, and we used to go back in the woods and shoot a lot. And I had a boat back there on the lake, and I had one of these plastic pontoon boats that Bass Pro Shops used to sell. And they're 2-man boat, really nice, very stable. And we used to fish in this thing. I mean, we've had this thing all over everywhere fishing, but I used to keep it back there on the lake. We went back there one morning to go fishing, and I mentioned I had a 4-wheeler, so we had a trail that ran along the side of this hill, and we had reinforced this trail to make it flat with quickcrete blocks that were broken up and leveled out with dirt over top to make it nice and level instead of riding on a hill. And somebody or something had taken big hand-sized chunks of this quickcrete and thrown it down into this boat with such force that it broke through the bottom of the plastic boat and ruined it. And so as my dad and I are looking at this scene, I asked him, I said, who in their right mind would do this? Because now the public can go back there. It's a public lake, so the public can go back there and fish. But the problem is this: if you're destroying somebody's boat and there's a hill right there, they didn't know that we weren't going to walk over that hill and catch them doing that. It's a good way to get shot. And second of all, I asked Dad, I said, who has enough power to take a rock like that, which wasn't all that heavy, and throw it with such force as to bust out a super heavy plastic bottom of a boat? I mean, this wasn't a cheap boat. It was very sturdily made. It was a very odd scene. And it was later that year that I was cutting grass. Another event occurred, and a friend of mine came over. We were going to go fishing back there, but I had to cut the front yard. So I told him, say, listen, you know where the boat is, you know the setup. Go back there, get in the boat, start fishing. When I get done, I'll come back there, yell for you, and you can paddle up. I'll jump in, and we'll fish the evening bite. And so he said, okay. He went back there. He was a city kid. He really didn't know much about the woods or anything, but he liked to fish, and we had a lot of fun fishing together. He's a funny guy. He's one of these guys that are genuinely funny. He came back up not long after that, and I saw him come up, and I was like, that's kind of odd. So I pulled up, turned the lawnmower off, and he was frazzled. He was definitely frazzled. And I asked him, what's the matter? He said, I'm not going to go back there. And I asked him, what happened? What? He said, I saw something. I don't know what it was. He said, but I don't want to go back there. And he was unwilling to go back unless I went with him. And I said, well, was it a bear? And he said, I don't know what it was. He said it was large, and it was black, and it was moving through the woods. And I pressed him again. You think it was a bear? And all he would say is, I just don't want to talk about it. And he refused to go back there again unless I went back there with him. I used to take a gun for snake purposes and whatnot. And so I always thought that was kind of odd. And it was the very next year that I used to have rabbits, and we had them in these nice cages we had built up and everything. And one morning, went back there to feed the rabbits, and the bottom of the wire cage, it's a wire, very well made cage, had been ripped open, and the rabbits were gone, completely gone. And my dad actually discovered the scene and told me about it. And I asked him, well, what could have done that? And he passed it off as a husky, a dog that used to get loose in the area and run around. But this husky, I got to thinking later, this husky had never had a reputation for doing anything bad. I mean, everybody kind of liked him. He just ran around. And furthermore, the force it would have taken, this was not just lightweight chicken wire. This was heavy metal gauge that we had put underneath there for these rabbits, and it had been ripped. The force that it would have took, I guess a dog could have done it, but he would have cut his mouth all to pieces in doing that. So a lot of these things, again, I'm putting this together years later and thinking to myself all these different things. And then I mentioned 2020 as being the year that everything kind of clicked. And the reason for that was I was fishing. It was during the lockdown, and I had a whole lot of time off. And so I did a lot of fishing. The lockdown was a lot of fun for me because I had many weeks off, and I fished every day. My boat stayed hooked up to my truck for 10 straight days, which was a new record. And one day in April, when I was fishing the lake, and it was maybe a mile that direction from where I'm sitting right now, I'm going along, and I hear very clearly 2 wood knocks, 1, 2. And I knew this was not something normal. It was not windy. It was something, it sounded like being knocked on a tree. 2 of them, bam, bam. And then there was nothing else. I just sat there for a while and listened, never heard anything else, never saw anything else, but it really got my attention. So much so that not long after that, my son and I went back there and were looking around, and we were amazed at all the tree structures that we found back there, spots where trees had been good sized trees about this big that were at the corners, wherever, like the path back, we have a path back there, wherever it would turn, there was a tree about this big around that had been snapped over about 8 feet up and was just laying over across the trail. And what was odd about it, because you could say, well, wind could do that, but none of the trees around anywhere else showed any signs of any sort of stress due to wind. It was very odd. And we noticed quite a few other things like that. And then not long after that, my son and his friend paddled across the lake over to where I heard the knocks. And they actually were walking around in there because that woods is owned by a local city, and people really are not allowed to go in there and hunt or anything like that. I mean, the city is pretty nice. They don't mind if you walk around, look and whatnot, but you're not supposed to be in there hunting or camping or anything like that. And so this is an area that's pretty much untouched or unwalked by humans. And they were up in there and found numerous places where trees, it looked very much like they had been placed in an X type structure, where 2 different trees had been taken and put in the fork of a tree and laid in, and then others where they had been laid across, like a tree had been laid from one arm to the other. So after that, this is when we're really starting to think, okay, this could be, is it possible, or are we just reading into stuff at this point? There was, we had this large turkey, about a 15-pound turkey, and I think we had a power outage or something, and the freezer it was in had thawed. We really weren't sure about this turkey, whether it was still good to eat or not. So we walked this thing out to the edge of the woods and just threw it into the tree line. And I just happened to go back there the next day, and this thing was gone. It hadn't been gnawed on. There was no drag marks at all. It was simply gone. Now, what picks up a 15-pound turkey and walks off with it? Coyotes aren't going to do that. They're just not. They're going to eat it right there. A bobcat is not capable of carrying off a 15-pound turkey. I mean, bobcats are pretty strong, but it's going to leave some drag marks. And so it was yet another thing that we thought seemed exceedingly odd, that turkey was simply gone. When we had, we used to have 2 large dogs, one Weimaraner, one Lab. And they stayed in the garage, but they had a dog door that went out to a run. So it was a good long run, probably 50 yards we had of a run that they could go out and, run around and whatnot. And then when I was out in the yard working, we'd let them out. But I've noticed at nighttime with them on a couple different nights, they would just be barking and barking and barking. And then the level of their intensity of their barking would all of a sudden go way up. And a couple nights in particular, both of them would stop barking at exactly the same time. And within seconds, I would hear that dog door hit back and forth, where they had both run into the garage. And I thought that was really, really odd that these two big dogs would be barking that ferociously and then stop at the same time and run full speed back into the garage and didn't come back out again the rest of the night. As all this stuff is happening, it came about that, and this is where you start to realize things that if you don't know to look for it, then you won't see it. But I'm coming out to go to work one morning, and there's a dead bird laying on the sidewalk, 100% right in the middle of the sidewalk. I mean, it's like 10 inches to the right, 10 inches to the left, is sitting right smack dab in the middle. It's just an odd thing. It didn't appear that this bird had died there. It looked like it had been laid there the way it was laying. It wasn't, its wings weren't all out and everything. It was perfectly laid there. And I know that Scott Carpenter had mentioned that he had this very thing happen in his driveway a lot, where they would put a bird exactly in the middle of his driveway. So, again, you say to yourself, well, it's possible the bird just was flying and then died. It happened to fall or whatever. Then I had 2 mornings where I went to get into my truck, and a feather from a different bird would be placed right underneath the driver's side door of my truck. Just one single feather laying perfectly right there underneath my driver's side truck. This happened on 2 different mornings, which is another thing that Scott Carpenter talked about, was that they would leave feathers around his place as well. Then Amy and I, over the course of 2 weeks, we had 3 different occasions when we were in the backyard walking, and large trees in the woods fell over, and you'd hear this, and then the loud crash as a tree would hit. I've lived here 35 years, and I don't think I've ever heard that any other time, except for one time during a horrible ice storm. But for it to happen 3 times in so short a period of time, and on days when the wind wasn't even blowing, was very odd. It was just very odd. The trees do fall in the woods, but to be falling that often, and always when we were walking the dog right at the back of the property, we both took note of that for sure. About this time, also, I was planting a lot of trees. I plant a ton of trees on the property, spruces and firs, because supposedly they don't grow in our area, but I think I've proven otherwise. I have a lot of them, and they're doing quite well. But I would plant quite a few. I would order them from New York, and I would get up to 50 at a time and have to plant them over a couple days. And the next day I would go out, and the ones back by the woods, I would find 2 or 3 that looked exactly like somebody had grabbed the tree, pulled it straight up out of the ground, and just dropped it on the ground and walked off. It was the weirdest thing. It wasn't scratch marks. It wasn't a raccoon trying to get at the roots or anything like that. It was just straight up out of the ground and then dropped. It was just laying there on the side. I was actually able to replant them, and they lived. Last year, this is one of the most recent. I have an area over there where a bunch of moss on the ground. It's not really grass. It's just moss, I guess, because it doesn't get a whole lot of sun. And so I'm walking through there, and I look, and there's a spot right in just one single. And how they do this, I don't know, but a lot of people talk about it. There's one single spot in this moss where there isn't moss, and it is the perfect shape of a Sasquatch footprint and the perfect size. It's about 18 inches long. And I mean, it's the perfect cutout. How on earth, and maybe not, it may have just been pure coincidence. Again, pure coincidence, it could have been, but because how does a foot hitting moss make the moss go away? I don't, unless the foot was wet or something, I don't know. But there it was, sitting right there, and you can just ignore it. And what am I going to do? I don't interact. I haven't gone out there to try to find out because about this time, I actually, one of the creepier things, had about 3 or 4 dreams, very, very vivid dreams about this time that involved these beings. And in the dreams, they were set in the woods, and they were in the dreams, and they weren't just normal. It was very vivid. It was concerning for sure. They weren't bad. They weren't violent dreams or anything. And all of them, it was just, I think one of them, I was back there fishing and was aware that one of these things was back there as well. Another one, one of them was peeking out from behind a tree. And then there was a couple more kind of like that, but they were different kind of dreams. And they all came within about 2 or 3 months of each other. And then there hasn't been any since. That was a couple years ago. And so Amy was driving around. We have a driveway that goes around by the woods. It comes around the back of the house one night, and she felt pretty sure that there had something, whether it was sticks or pine cones, was thrown at the vehicle and hit the side of the vehicle. And stuff like that we keep tabs of. I had a trail cam back there back in probably about 10, 12 years ago. I had a trail cam. I would put food back there. I was trying to get a coyote or a bobcat and never got anything. I got plenty of foxes and raccoons and stuff like that. I stopped putting it back there. But there was plenty of times when the food was gone and no animal had been caught, which I always thought that was kind of odd, how the animal could have gotten the food out and not triggered the camera. That happened several times. But again, every last one of these things that I've listed out here, I'll be the first to point out there could be a very simple explanation for every one of them. There's a couple of them that are pretty tough. The tree knocks, that one is not going to be. It was not a woodpecker. I know what woodpeckers are. This was very different, and than that. And this is not a teenager, a local teenager. That's this again. This is something that's gone on now since 1985 or so. And I don't know if there's a teenager. First of all, they wouldn't be a teenager anymore. But to have that kind of patience and to be that subtle in a prank is, especially a prank that we didn't even catch on to until a couple of years ago. I don't think that's the case, because people are going to grasp for, there's two extremes here. There's the extreme of attributing every little thing to the activity of these creatures, and then there's the opposite extreme of coming up with the most ridiculous explanations possible. And like the trees were knocked over by a squirrel or a deer. It's like, well, deer don't knock over trees that are this big around. They just don't do it, and squirrels don't either. So you have to kind of walk the middle of the road and try to keep, you don't want to suspend reason, and yet you don't want to have your head in the sand at the same time. That's pretty much it. I have a few more, but they're a little different, so I'll save those for after you get done. I know you probably wrote some notes down.
If that's a prank going on this long, that's some dedication right there. Yeah, it's a generational thing right there. It's like, all right, let's bring the kids in and teach them about the prank that we got going, and now probably the grandkids. It's a family tradition now, guys. Come on in. Let's talk about the prank we play.
Right.
Some of the things that you mentioned, I've gone deep down this cryptid rabbit hole since we started talking about it, since you first introduced it to me on vacation. But ever since, we started having discussions, and you would tell us these stories, and, it would carry on over to the next year, and you'd have a new cryptid to talk about. And ever since then, I've gone deep down this rabbit hole, and I'm probably a little modest there. But some of the things that you've mentioned, and I've got 3 Post-it notes full of notes here that I made, because these are things that happen in all the stories I hear. And, most of these stories, some of them aren't, some of them, they don't see anything, but most of the stories and most of the things that you've brought up are things that happen when people physically see these creatures. And it's not necessarily just Sasquatch, but some of the things do pertain to Sasquatch. The first thing was, you said your friend saw something walking in the woods, something black walking in the woods, and he wouldn't talk about it. And you said he absolutely refused to talk about it. That happens so many times in cryptid stories, and it's not just with Sasquatch either. It's with every type of cryptid. People see these things, they will not talk about it. Will not talk about it. I guess it's kind of the seeing something that's not supposed to exist, and just if also if it was a normal animal your friend had seen, he would have told you, "Hey, I saw a bear back there. Hey, I saw a cougar. I saw a coyote." It wouldn't have been a big deal. He wouldn't have refused to talk about seeing a normal animal. He saw something that shook him to his core, and he did not want to talk about it. Refused to talk about it, and that's something that happens a lot in these stories. When your dad told you that husky ripped the bottom of the rabbit cage out, do you think that was just to not to scare you? Do you think he had any idea, or?
There's no doubt that he acted funny about the whole thing. He did not want to discuss it. It was, I remember feeling like I had not been given all the information.
A lot of people in these stories, especially children, when they go and tell their parents something, like especially in an area where there's a lot of activity that happens, they'll say that their parents act concerned. They're genuinely concerned, but they don't look that surprised. And they don't just quickly dismiss it as, especially like adults looking back at something that happened in their childhood and they think about their parents' reaction and they're telling the story. They're like, now that I'm looking back, my mom looked very concerned for our safety, obviously, but at the same time, she did not look as surprised as I thought she'd be. She didn't just dismiss it as a child's imagination. So the fact that, you didn't feel like you were given the whole truth is another thing that points you to maybe there's more to this. Maybe it is a cryptid. The tree snapped in half. You said they were snapped in a way, but they were still kind of connected, just kind of like making an L, or not
Yep.
not an L, but you know what I mean, just kind of like
Yep.
that happens a lot in Sasquatch stories. Either the tree is completely snapped, like thick, sturdy trees. You said they're about that big around.
They were, every bit of that big around, yeah.
And I'm sure that big around, thick and sturdy, and they're not going to easily be snapped even by like wind or anything like that, right? So something with some strength had to snap these trees, and sometimes they're completely snapped in half, and then other times they're found like you mentioned, with like the top just like straight over like that, and that's it's I just it's starting to add up to be too much of a coincidence. It's starting to be, obviously you could say that maybe do you have bears in that area?
Very rarely. Very
rarely?
rare. I've never seen one myself in this area.
So maybe a bear ran into the tree and snapped it and knocked it over, but I don't know, from the way you told it, there's so many. You said there were a bunch of trees like that, right?
Yeah, there was and they were all different ways. Some of them were like trees that had been laid to form like big giant X's in the woods, and others were bent to where this tree was completely bent over like a horseshoe and wedged up underneath another tree or a log or something like that. It's just really, really weird looking.
Animals, animals wouldn't do that. People maybe, but how would they take a tree that size and snap it? How would they take a tree that size and make a horseshoe out of it, and be able to move it and shove it up under another tree? It would take a lot of doing. There'd probably be some drag marks on the ground. There would be obvious signs of somebody doing that. Another thing is gifting, and I'm not saying you gifted, but it seems like they have gifted you. They left the dead bird. They left feathers. These are all signs of gifting. Do you think maybe they thought that the turkey was your gift to them? Did all of this happen kind of like close together?
Yep.
So you found the dead bird and the feather very shortly after you threw the turkey in the woods.
All of that occurred within probably 4 months of themselves. I mean, the turkey was in wintertime, and then the other two things were early spring.
Do you think they thought that you were gifting with them? Do you think they thought that the turkey was a gift?
It's entirely possible. The way it was we just threw it out there. It's entirely possible. It's
because in a lot of these stories, people do gift with these creatures, and
I know.
they leave things out for them, and then they have things
Right.
left for them. So when you
Yep.
said that, I was going to ask how close together it happened, but now that you say it's only within a couple of months, then I'm thinking maybe if there is something out there, then it I mean, because yeah, the bird could have fell out of the sky, could have died of natural causes, but to be exactly in the center of the sidewalk, and then the feather being like right directly under your driver's side, a single feather. I mean, a lot of feathers. You think, okay, something attacked a bird here, but one single feather, and I've heard of this happening in other stories too, like you said with Scott Carpenter. I've heard of feathers being left, other dead animals being left with people who do gift with these things, and I'm thinking maybe it thought the turkey was a gift, so it left you a couple of things.
Yeah, there was one morning I went out. I forgot to mention this, and there was two sticks laid in a perfect X underneath the driver's side door of my truck.
Right
Now
where the
those
feather
sticks,
was.
right now those sticks could have fallen out of a tree. In a perfect X, it's entirely possible, but it's kind of odd. It was I immediately noticed it, and it was as if it was there to be noticed.
And it was around the same
But
time as the bird and the feather.
no, I'd say the stick thing was probably a good year later.
Hmm.
Yep.
But going back to the turkey, actually, any kind of animal would have left evidence. Like you said, most animals are too small to drag off a 15-pound turkey. They would have just left it there and chewed on it, and you would have found like parts of the turkey left, with some
Right.
of it scattered around, then like markings on the ground from where this animal had come up to eat it. Or if something big enough had dragged it off, you would have seen drag marks or possibly footprints or parts of the turkey along the way as they were eating it, as they were dragging it. It's
Right.
just it really seems like something came up, picked it up, and just carried it off.
Well, here's the thing. It could very well have been a cougar, but at this point, there have been far more Squatch sightings in our area than there have been cougar sightings. So the odds are in favor of it being, because that's the next part I was going to talk about. Is it's not just my house and property. It's this area has had some as well. I don't want to cut you off though if you have more.
Oh yeah, I just have one more
Yeah.
thing, and then
Sure.
we'll definitely get into that because I thought of that, but I thought maybe it was one of those things, so I didn't want to bring it up. The dreams you had, I've heard a lot of stories where these beings, these creatures, these cryptids seem to be able to affect our dreams. A lot of them are said to be able to use mind speak, Sasquatch, Dogman, and if they do
They totally
have
do.
that, and if they do have this ability, who's to say that they can't affect our dreams? Who's to say that they can't alter our thoughts? That's all I had. If you wanted to add to that, the dreams and the mind speak.
I agree 100%. I mean, there is zero doubt in my mind that they engage in both of those things. What's the guy, man, the Survivor man? I don't watch the show, but I'm aware of him. I forget his name. It's on Discovery Channel. The guy who does all the Survivor Man stuff that's very popular. And I'm drawing a blank on his name. And he went into this. Too. Yeah, Bear Gillis was the other one. There's two of them. Les Stroud. That's it. He went into this and, he did a lot of research. He went out and did some experiences and whatnot. And it wasn't long at all before he encountered Mindspeak. And it really upset him. He was not prepared for it. And they basically said to him in his mind, we're right over here if you're willing to look. And he looked over and saw, and so it is reported a great deal by people. It is something to where, especially the dreams, I'd say at least half, if not 3/4 of all eyewitnesses of the Dogman talk about having their dreams affected and that they keep encountering these creatures in their dreams. Now, some of it's probably post-traumatic stress disorder, but some of it probably isn't. My experience was a very short period of time for the most part. And I think it's significant that it's always all of mine are set back in the woods back there, which is where they hang out. It's there if they are back there. And again, it's if that's their area back there where they have been for at least 35 years. There's a lot of, I was back there fishing a few weeks ago, and there's a lot more woods back there than than I really thought. There's just a lot. And there's islands on the lake that they could get out onto, and nobody would ever bother them. So for me, it's a done deal. They definitely could do the mind speak. And that proves right there they're not just an ape or a monkey. There's just so much to all this. It's a troubling topic. It's nothing to be alarmed about as a Christian. There are people who are having bad experiences right now because they live out in the rural areas and they're being harassed. Scott Carpenter, that's basically his ministry, is he tries to help these people because they don't like, how many times I've heard people to tell the story about getting their dream home and then it turns into a nightmare because of their unwanted experiences with these things. We haven't had that at all. It hasn't really bothered us. I go back in the woods and do all sorts. I don't worry 2 cents about it. It's not a big deal to me. Some of the other things I mentioned, there's another lake. Our area has a lot of lakes around here. Another lake back in the mid 80s, a friend of mine, his cousins lived further back on the lake, and they were hearing a lot of very strange things, roars and calls at nighttime. And again, that's something you can chalk up to a lot of different things. Bear, it's not bear. Bear don't roar at nighttime. They just don't. Tigers do. Lions might. I'm not an expert on lions, but bear don't. And fox makes some weird noises, but they don't have volume. So then we had one of the things that was very interesting. Just this year, I became aware of a gentleman, and I've actually gotten in touch with him, who lives up the road, probably about 6 or 7 miles. And he has a good sized piece of land that he hunts, that he owns or has access to. And he has had numerous encounters with the family of these creatures that live on this property. And he's actually seen one of them on one occasion. On another occasion, he was hunting. And like I said, this is right up the road. I don't give locations because I don't want, people to go out there and, start knocking on trees and harassing the guy. But it's just right up the road near a river in the area. And it's pretty close to a river. And he was out. His first clue that really got him worried was he found a yellow perch, was in the snow. And it was real cold. This was a couple years back. And it looked as if somebody had taken a bite out of the stomach of this perch and then just thrown it onto the ice. And he said it looked just like a human mouth had done it. And it wasn't long after that before he was out hunting, and it was still dark out, and one of these things walked up to his deer stand he was in from behind. And it really unnerved him. And then it took off running and ran and jumped across a small ditch, or it was like a stream almost, and he could hear it. And when it hit, he said that the sound let him know that this thing weighed many, many hundreds of pounds. It was huge, he said. It broke off some limbs as it went through the woods. And when it came first light, he left. And then it wasn't long after that, he was hunting a different part of the property. He had managed to convince himself that the other thing that had happened, that's what happens. A lot of people convince themselves that it was just a woodpecker or a chipmunk or something. And but he saw one. He thinks it was the juvenile that had bitten out of the fish. And he was panning, and he looked, and the thing was just running. And he said it was waving its arms in a crazy way. He said it was bizarre looking. And when they're younger, they do have more of an orangutan look to them for some reason. A lot of them do. It's when they get older, they really take on the human look. And he's had a lot of calls and whistles and yells at nighttime to where he's aware that he's got him on his property. And he's invited me to come over there and look and walk the grounds and whatnot. But I don't even want to do that. I do not. The subject is interesting, but I'm not into it. I mean, I agree with Steve Ishdahl. I don't want a relationship. I'm not going to put gifts out. If I did it accidentally, I'm not doing it anymore. And I don't want to go out and walk the grounds. I appreciate the offer. And, I told the guy, listen, if you have grandkids, don't let them out playing by themselves because they will snatch them. But thankfully, he doesn't have any little grandkids or anything. His kids are grown up. And then he told me that in the late 80s, about a mile and a half from my house, his friend saw one of these things at the back of another lake, yet another lake that we have, and it was toward the back of this lake. And this friend of his was going down a trail, and the thing was squatted down with its back to him in the middle of the trail, and it stood up and turned and looked at him, and then just walked off. This was either a beige or a white colored, which is pretty rare. And that was about a mile from the house here, at the same time that my neighbor had the thing roar at him from the woods. Then there has been, there was another fisherman that reported a monster in that lake, that same lake. And at the time we laughed at it because the lakes are small. We thought he was talking about lake monster. It wasn't until later it dawned on me this guy probably was talking about something else. And we had assumed he meant that it was in the lake, and these lakes are just way too small for anything like that. And then there was up the road, a different direction, probably about 10 miles, I found some eyewitness where one of these things was apparently peering into the window of a country church. I'm not sure if it was on Sunday morning or what was going on, but the thing was seen. I don't think anybody was in the church, but it was seen by passerby peering in the window of the church. And the person, I think, laid on the horn or something, and it ran off into the woods. And then lastly, up the road in the last direction, I've basically been bracketed here, there was somebody who saw one cross the road in front of them. And then up the James River, north of us, there's a corridor between Smithfield, Virginia, and Hopewell, Virginia, along the James, where there has just been a ton of sightings. I mean, you can imagine, I mean, all sorts of stuff that goes on to this day. People that have seen deer walk across the road with, I've seen squatches walk across the road with deer slung over their shoulders. People I've talked to that had childhood encounters up along through there. It's a real hot spot. And of course, the Petersburg area of Virginia has some areas just west of Petersburg that are big time hot spots, especially those forts like Fort Lee, Fort Pickett that are out there, have a lot. AP Hill is another one that have a lot of encounters and sightings out there. So, as crazy as it sounds, it's, it would be kind of the exception for us to be here where we are and not have. And that's why I was saying at the beginning, many of the people who may hear this, if you like, for example, if I know we've talked about it before, where your grandparents lived, the woods back behind there, I always thought were some of the creepiest woods I've ever seen. I don't know what it was. As a kid, I would not go near those woods. It just reeked of something. Of course, I was a kid. I didn't know about this stuff, but I was convinced there's monsters in those woods. They were just dark, and your area, of course, where you are, and everywhere in between the two of us has just tons of sightings. And so it's everywhere. It really is everywhere. If you have trees in any number, you're going to have these creatures. There are far more of them than anybody realizes. They are just that good at remaining concealed, and they may move around. I don't know if we do have any. I don't know if they're back there all the time, or if at certain times of the year. It seems to be seasonal. I just can't put my finger on what season it is. It doesn't seem to really be in wintertime. Maybe they up and leave and go south in the winter. I just don't know. There's so much we don't know that it's at times it's infuriating. But last thing I'll say, I'll turn it back over to you. My friend who saw that back in the woods, and my neighbor who was roared at, both of them forgot that I asked them just a few years ago about it. Neither one of them could remember. And that is another thing that happens a lot with these reports, is that people forget. And later on, eyewitnesses who've encountered something will go and ask their friends who were there about it, and their friends say, I don't know what you're talking about. Why can you not, when I'm talking about, you were right there. And it's not a matter of them just refusing. They literally have forgotten. And it's a strange phenomenon with this thing where people forget these encounters. How could you forget something that shook you up so much? And like my neighbor, he's the one that told me the story, not the other way around. And yet he's forgotten it, and I remember it. So there's just a lot of crazy stuff with all of this.
I mean, that happens a lot in these stories too. People forget, and maybe they're suppressing the memory. Maybe it's too traumatic for them. When you told the story about the roaring behind your neighbor's house, he people try to dismiss it as like a cougar or something. And that's what you do. You try to find a rational explanation for these things, and
Sure.
that's the first thing I do when I hear these stories. It's like first thing I do is I take the story and I try to run through all the rational explanations, and then when those run out, it's like okay, maybe there's something to this,
Right.
you know. So maybe he just selectively forgot about this on purpose because he didn't want to think about what could
Right.
be behind his house, what could have made that roar that he, obviously knew wasn't any kind of normal animal that people said it was. But there,
Well, that does happen because there's a lot of people who write into Steve Ishtal, and they will say that their encounter they had totally, completely forgotten, and then something jogs their brain and they remember it, and it's not a matter of them having intentionally forgotten it. It had been wiped from their memory until years later, and all of a sudden they remember it. And it's the most bizarre thing. You don't hear that as much, but I hear it at least probably once a week on his channel where somebody will write in and say that when I heard you reading the letter, all of a sudden I remembered my encounter and I had forgotten it for 10 years.
well, and a lot of these stories, sometimes people will be walking like on a trail. They'll be in a park or something. They'll be walking on a trail and they'll be going deeper into the woods. They'll come across something bizarre or see something bizarre, like a creature, like your friend did, who didn't want to talk about it. And then the next thing they know, they're walking out of the woods into the parking lot
Yeah.
to their car, and they don't know how
Yep.
they got there. So if these things can mind speak, if they can affect our dreams, who's to say they can't, mess with our minds and our memories? And there's a ton of stories I've heard where people have that phenomenon happen. They're walking in the forest, they see one of these things. Next thing they know, they're walking out of the trail into the parking lot, or they're, back at the trailhead, and they don't know how they got there. They don't remember
Right.
walking back to it. I'm walking along. Oh, wow, what's that? Now I'm back in the parking lot. It's like, and there's no memory of anything in between. And this happens a lot, and especially with Sasquatch.
Yep.
Especially with Sasquatch. But back to your point about him inviting you up to his land to come have a look and to come try to find these things. Yeah, I wouldn't go either. I don't need to see one of these things. I definitely don't want to come across one. I don't want to have an encounter. But you also have to be careful what you invite into your life. And we've talked about
Yep.
this before. If you go out seeking, you will find. And
Yep.
whether it's seeking the Lord or it's seeking other, darker things in this world, if you go out seeking, you will find. If you knock on that door enough, good or bad, something on the other side is going to answer. And these things, they like you said, there's stories about Sasquatch particularly following people home. The hitchhiker effect is what it's called.
Yep.
And these people have gone out squatch hunting. They go out knocking on trees and whooping and yelling in the woods and trying to communicate with these things, and they attract them. You attract these things, and they attach themselves to you, kind of like spirits or demons or anything like that, and they will follow you home. And so, my point is, you just have to be careful what you go searching for, because no matter what it is, good or bad, you're probably going to find something. And if it's bad, if it's on the darker side, you're not going to like what you find. So you have to be careful what you let into your life. And if you had accepted the invitation and gone out there and found one of these things and interacted with it, there's no telling what kind of storm you would have brought into your life. And we've talked about this before too, with like demons. You have to give them permission.
Right.
And by going out and seeking them, that's kind of like whether you knowingly do it or not, you're giving them permission to interact with you. You're giving them permission to follow you home,
Right.
so to speak. But whether it's intentional or unintentional, you have to be careful what you invite into your life, because it can lead to disastrous things.
Yeah, there's no good that can come of it, and there's nothing to be gained. And a lot of the people talk about that the Squatch interactions are just the beginning, and then it gets crazier from there. And even the Scott Carpenter talks about it started out, he was looking for what he thought were large, hairy, undiscovered apes of North America that walked on two legs. And next thing you know, he was dealing with orbs and seeing dogmen. And And he had not bargained for that. At one point, he was convinced that he was in the last moments of his life when he was just a few yards away from a dog man that was peering through, and he got video of it. You can see it plain as day. And so I just, I'm not about that at all. You know, and I think part of the reason why people are allured to this stuff because it's the unknown and it's excitement in their life. When you know the Lord, you don't need that. I have plenty. I know that the Lord exists. I think it makes it also easier when you know the Lord exists and you have a relationship. You realize that a lot of society is wrong about missing out on knowing the Lord. And so if they're wrong about the Lord, they can be wrong about a lot of things. And then when you look into this, you begin to realize that, yeah, this stuff is real as well. And so it's, if I'm going to want to have a supernatural encounter, it's going to be with the Lord and not one of these gross, smelly, hairy things.
There's just one more point I wanted to make before we end this episode. And you had talked about going to my grandparents' house and how you found the woods behind their house creepy. And it could just us being kids, but I always found those woods to be creepy as well. Walking back through there, I don't know, but they had a horse who roamed that property and never had any problems, never had any signs of being attacked or anything. Yeah. And I've never seen it come charging out of those woods scared of anything. But it could just us being kids. But I always kind of found those woods back there to be behind the barn, right? Going back through there, yeah. I always found it a little creepy back there myself. But there are woods behind my parents' house where I grew up, and I rode 4-wheelers back through there. I went back there. I walked back there. I spent time back there. Just pretty much every inch of those woods I've been to and been through, and I've never once felt or experienced one single thing. But like you said, you never did either.
Right.
So I don't know, it's just bizarre.
I never did either, and I never thought. I mean, all the stuff I've listed off, I didn't even put 2 and 2 together, and because with these beings, lack of evidence of them being around is not proof that they're not around. So many people that write into the Steve Ishdahl show talk about having an encounter, a dramatic encounter on land that they have hunted their entire lives and never had anything until the day they did. So that could come, like we were just talking about, with them being somewhat transient. Maybe they are in areas sometimes and not all the time. And so you have to have a connection there between you being there and them being there. They're not omnipresent. And so, but there's no doubt that just because you haven't had anything is by no means proof that they're not there. And I would wager that unless you live in the desert, and there's even sightings in the desert, but for the most part, if you're anywhere in the east, the northwest, or the north central plains, and even the American Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico have plenty of sightings. It's pretty much every county in North America.
Well, the American Southwest has their own stuff to worry about out there with the Navajo Nation and the skinwalkers and stuff. That's huge area for hotbed for that particular type of cryptid. But unless you had anything else, I think it's probably a good place to stop this one today.
Yeah, that's it.
These sightings are increasing. Back in the 80s, like you said, 80s and 90s, it was just the Pacific Northwest for Bigfoot. And we hadn't even heard of any of these other ones, dogman, crawlers, right? Anything else out there that you can think of. We've never heard of any of them. And now all of a sudden, just sightings from everywhere. And like you said, the internet plays its part. But with your particular case, I'll use it as an example for what I'm about to say. One little thing, probably nothing. 2 things, okay, maybe, maybe. But when stuff starts happening right after another, it just continues, the evidence continues to pile up right in front of you. It's kind of hard to ignore. So when, even though we have the internet and we do have a way for people to get their stories out there faster, more and more stories from every corner of the world are coming in about all kinds of different types of cryptids. It's not just Bigfoot. So, 1 or 2 stories here and there, okay, maybe. But, when you have the evidence, like in your case, all the stories from all over the world, thousands and thousands, Steve Ishdahl, if you watch his channel, every single day, more and more emails coming in He reads them out
Yep.
all the time.
Yeah.
It's just, it's a little.
It's been going on for years. He's been doing it for years, every day.
Yeah. Sightings of these creatures are starting to mount and starting to add up. But that's going to do it for this episode. I appreciate you being willing to tell your story and be able to list all that out. I know you're subjecting yourself to a lot of skepticism and stuff. So You're pretty brave coming on and talking about it. But the more I hear that you say, and with everything happening, it's not just you. And that's another thing I look for in these stories too. It's not just you. It's people around you, very close to where you live. And I don't know. I just think you could possibly have some Bigfoot activity out behind your home or all over that area. And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.